In the autumn of 1899, a shift crew working a lower lateral in the Consolidated Virginia mine on the Comstock lode in Nevada broke through a collapsed stope wall and found themselves in a passage that was not on any current working map. The Comstock was not a place where undocumented passages were unusual. The lode had been worked since 1859. The tunneling network beneath Virginia City ran for hundreds of miles in aggregate, and survey records were inconsistent across the dozens of companies that had owned and abandoned and re-entered portions of the system over 40 years. Undocumented passages were found regularly. Men had died in them. They were logged, assessed, and either incorporated into the working system or sealed. This passage was different, and the difference was apparent within the first 20 feet. The shift foreman, a man named Patrick Dolan, wrote a brief account of the discovery in a letter to his wife that December. The letter has survived because his wife kept it, and because her descendants donated a box of family correspondence to the Nevada Historical Society in Reno in 1978. The letter was cataloged as part of the donation but not separately described. The finding aid lists it only as family correspondence. P. Dolan, Story County, 1890s, 1900s. I found it because I was searching the Historical Society's catalog for any Dolan associated with Comstock mining records, after finding the name in a different document entirely. Dolan was not a careful writer, and the letter is not long, but what he describes in 3 paragraphs of slanted cursive is precise enough that I have read it many times and am confident about what he is reporting. He writes first about the air, which is where a miner's attention goes before anything else. He writes that the air in the passage was different from anything he had breathed in 22 years underground. Not the sour, close air of a worked section, not the gassy air of an abandoned stope, but what he calls, in his letter, clean and cold, like a cellar in winter. Clean air in a deep lateral of a hard rock mine that had been worked continuously for 40 years is not something that happens naturally. Clean air means ventilation, active ventilation, of a kind that Dolan, a 22-year underground man, would have recognized as deliberate. He writes this in 1 sentence and moves on. But I want you to sit with it for a moment, because a sealed, undocumented passage with active ventilation is not a geological anomaly, and it is not a collapsed stope. It is a maintained space. He writes that the walls had been worked, not by mining, but finished. The rock dressed to a consistent surface in a way that Dolan did not recognize as any mining technique he had encountered in the Comstock or anywhere else he had worked. He was specific about this because the distinction mattered to him. He was a man who had spent 2 decades reading underground surfaces, and he knew the difference between rock fractured by powder and pick and rock worked deliberately to a finished face. He noted that the dressing was consistent across the full length of the passage he could see, not a section, not a partial treatment, but continuous from where he entered to where his light gave out. He writes that there were things on shelves. He used that word, shelves, cut into the dressed wall at regular intervals, at a height he describes as about chest level, of a depth he estimates as roughly 1.5 feet. On the shelves were objects he describes as books, or something like books. Bound, rectangular, stacked horizontally, and other objects he cannot identify, and he writes that the whole of it ran further than his lamp could show. He does not describe going further. He does not describe taking anything off the shelves. He describes standing in the entrance of the passage with his lamp, looking at what the lamp reached, and then going back out and sealing the entry his crew had broken through, and sending a man up to the superintendent. That is all he did. He had been underground long enough to know that what you do not understand, you do not disturb. And then he sent a man up to the superintendent, and waited, and 11 days later the army came. The United States Army arrived at the Consolidated Virginia Mine 11 days after Dolan's crew made their discovery. I know this because of a single entry in the mine's superintendent's log for that month. A log held in the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, as part of the Mackay School of Earth Sciences and Engineering collection, which records, under the date of November 14, 1899, the following: U.S. Army Engineers, 4 men plus officer, arrived per telegraph notice. Lower workings, southern lateral. Access restricted per War Department order, same date. 4 words after the mine's own superintendent was told his men could not go back in. Access restricted per War Department order. No explanation given, no prior correspondence referenced in the log, no indication that the superintendent asked for one or received one. The log's next entry, 3 days later, records the resumption of normal operations in all other sections of the mine. The southern lateral, Dolan's lateral, is not mentioned again in any entry for the remaining years the log covers. By the time this is over, you will understand what Dolan described finding in that passage, what the Army's presence 11 days later implies about how quickly word of the discovery traveled, and through what channels it traveled, and why the only surviving contemporary account of what was found in the southern lateral is a letter written by a shift foreman to his wife in the months before he left Nevada and never came back. He left. That is not a phrase I want to slip past you. Patrick Dolan was a 22-year veteran of underground mining work on the Comstock. He knew no other trade, no other town, no other identity. Story County is where he had built his life. The 1880 and 1890 federal censuses both list him there, in Virginia City, with an occupation of miner and then mine foreman, which is the full arc of a working man's career in that world, and a career that is not lightly abandoned. Men who rose to shift foreman on the Comstock were not restless laborers. They were experienced, trusted, known by name to the mine management, earning wages that reflected their value. They did not simply leave. The 1900 federal census, taken in June of that year, does not list a Patrick Dolan in Story County or in any neighboring Nevada county. I searched adjacent counties. I searched the broader Nevada enumeration. I searched the California border counties that Comstock men sometimes relocated to. He is not there. I found a Patrick Dolan matching his approximate age, listed as 51 in the 1890 Story County census, which would put him at 60 in 1900, in the federal census for Silver Bow County, Montana, which is the county containing Butte. Another mining town, the only world such a man would know how to inhabit. Whether it is the same man I cannot prove from census records alone, because Patrick Dolan was not an uncommon name in the mining west of the 1890s. What I can prove is that the shift foreman who found the passage in November 1899 is not in Nevada in June 1900, and did not return to Nevada in any record I have been able to trace. Before I tell you what else the documents show, I want to be precise about the Comstock itself, because the specific character of the lode matters for what the passage represents, and because the Comstock's documented history makes the absence of any prior record of the passage a more significant fact than it would be at most other sites. The Comstock was not a simple mining operation. At its peak in the 1870s, it was the most technically complex hard rock mining enterprise in the world, with a ventilation system engineered by Adolph Sutro, an underground railway, a timber supply chain stretching across the Sierra Nevada, and a workforce that at various times included engineers, geologists, and mining scientists from Germany, France, Cornwall, Ireland, Mexico, and China. The tunneling work produced a map of the subsurface beneath Virginia City that was, by 1880, among the most detailed underground surveys of any site on the continent. Philip Dudisheimer, whose square-set timbering system made the Comstock's deep-level mining possible, was trained in Germany. The Sutro Tunnel, completed in 1879, runs 4 miles from the Carson River to the lowest levels of the Comstock workings, and was described by the congressional reports authorizing its construction as a feat of engineering without precedent in American mining. The people who worked the Comstock were not amateurs. Their maps were not casual documents. And the passage Dolan's crew found was not on those maps. It was not on the original surveys, not on the consolidated maps produced when the major mining companies merged their operations in the 1870s, not on the resurveys conducted when new lateral workings were extended in the 1880s and 1890s. It appeared on no document produced by any of the dozens of companies that had worked the Comstock between 1859 and 1899. That absence is more significant than it sounds. The Comstock's underground geography was mapped with obsessive thoroughness because the economics of deep hard rock mining required it. A missed survey could mean a wall breaking into a flooded adjacent working and killing everyone on the shift. Engineers mapped because their lives and the lives of their men depended on the accuracy of the maps. A passage that did not appear on any of those maps, in a lode that had been mapped for 40 years, was not simply overlooked. This is the part I keep returning to. The War Department's involvement is the piece I want to describe carefully, because it is the piece most susceptible to overstatement, and I do not want to overstate it. What the superintendent's log records is real. 4 Army engineers and an officer, arriving by telegraph notice, restricting access to the southern lateral under a War Department order. That much is documented. What I cannot document from the superintendent's log alone is the chain of communication that got them there in 11 days. 11 days from a shift crew's discovery to a federal military presence at a mine in Nevada is not a long time in 1899, given telegraph communication. But it requires that someone notified someone, and that the notification traveled up a chain fast enough that an Army unit was dispatched within days. It requires that the notification carried enough information for the War Department to decide that military engineers, rather than a territorial or federal civilian authority, were the appropriate response. And it requires that the War Department had some prior framework for understanding what a shift crew finding a dressed stone passage with shelved objects in a Nevada mine meant. Because you do not send Army engineers to a mining accident or a structural anomaly. You send Army engineers when you believe you understand what you are dealing with, and you have decided it falls under military jurisdiction. I have not found the communication that triggered the Army's arrival. I have not found any War Department record referencing the Comstock in November 1899 in any collection I have searched. The Army's records from this period are held primarily at the National Archives, Record Group 94. And I have searched the relevant index categories without finding a Comstock entry. The absence of a record is not proof of suppression. Records from this period were inconsistently maintained, and significant gaps exist in the official files for routine reasons. But the absence of a record in a case where a record was clearly generated is worth noting. Someone sent a telegraph. Someone received it. Someone issued an order. The order was followed. None of that paperwork is in any archive I have found. There is a second document. I need to tell you about it carefully because its provenance is less clean than the superintendent's log or Dolan's letter, and I will not claim more for it than I can support. In 2003, an antiquarian bookseller in Sacramento named Raymond Cho offered for sale a small collection of documents he described as originating from the estate of a former Nevada mining official, provenance uncertain. Late 19th century. The collection was purchased by a private buyer and did not enter any institutional collection that I have found. Before the sale, however, Cho had the documents photographed for his catalog. And those catalog photographs, 31 images covering multiple documents, were preserved in digital form when Cho's business digitized its historical records in 2011. Cho died in 2019. His business archive, including the digital catalog files, was acquired by a used book cooperative in Sacramento that has made portions of it accessible to researchers on request. I requested access to the Comstock-related photographs in 2022, describing the nature of my research, and received scans of 23 of the 31 images. Of those 23 images, the most significant shows what appears to be a handwritten internal memorandum, partially damaged by water and with several lines illegible, that is identified in Cho's catalog as Wardept. Communication Re. Comstock, 1899. Orig. The visible portions of the document, as I can read them from the photograph, include the date November 1899 in the upper right corner, a reference to the Southern Passage, CVM, which would be Consolidated Virginia Mine, and, in the body of the text, a partial sentence that reads, "The materials therein are of a character that requires removal to a secure federal facility before any further." The sentence ends at the right margin of the damaged portion and does not continue on the visible section of the page. There is a partial signature at the bottom, below a line of text I cannot read, that appears to end in L. Maj. Corps of Engineers. I want to be honest about what this document is and is not. It is a photograph of a document whose original I have not seen, whose chain of custody is incomplete, and whose authenticity I cannot verify with the tools available to me. It is consistent with everything else the documented record shows. It uses language, materials of a character that requires removal to a secure federal facility. That, if authentic, confirms that the Army engineers who arrived at the Consolidated Virginia Mine in November 1899 found something they considered worth removing and worth securing under federal custody. It names the Consolidated Virginia Mine explicitly. It carries a November 1899 date. But a photograph of a document is not the document, and I will not treat it as confirmed evidence. I will treat it as corroborating possibility, something that fits, something that is consistent, something that the rest of the documented record makes more plausible than it would be on its own. Because here is what the rest of the documented record shows. It shows a shift foreman finding a dressed stone passage with shelved objects, who writes about it to his wife, and then leaves Nevada within 6 months. It shows a mine superintendent's log recording an Army presence with restricted access under a War Department order, and then never mentioning the southern lateral again. It shows no subsequent description of the passage from any source, no newspaper account, no mine company document, no geological survey, no subsequent report of any kind that suggests the passage was reopened, investigated, or even acknowledged after November 1899. It shows a complete documentary silence falling over a specific section of a mine that had been generating paperwork continuously for 40 years. That is not the profile of a routine discovery. Routine discoveries generate paperwork. They generate inspection reports, sealing records, company memos about why the passage is not viable for working, correspondence about liability, follow-up visits from company engineers, notation in the working maps. The Comstock's records are dense with this material for every other anomalous discovery the mine produced across 4 decades: collapsed stopes, flooded sections, gas pockets, passages from earlier operations that had been abandoned and forgotten and were re-encountered by later crews. All of it documented. All of it traceable. The Mackay School collection at the Bancroft holds decades of Consolidated Virginia Mine paperwork, and I have read substantial portions of it. And for every other incident of consequence, I found documentation at multiple levels: the foreman's log, the superintendent's log, the company secretary's correspondence, Occasionally, a legal filing. The southern lateral produces a 4-word entry, access restricted per War Department order, and then silence. Not a thin documentary trail, not a sketchy record. Silence. The passage is not mentioned in the company's board minutes for November or December 1899. It is not mentioned in the superintendent's correspondence with the company's San Francisco office, which otherwise handled every significant operational development. It is not mentioned in the next round of working maps produced by the company's engineers, which were updated the following spring and show the southern section with no notation of any anomaly. The passage was sealed, and the maps were updated without it, and the company proceeded as though it had never been found, which means either that the company was told to proceed in that way, or that the people inside the company who knew about it decided, individually or collectively, that the silence was the appropriate response. Silence of this kind, in an archive this dense, is not the absence of a record. It is the record. There were 6 men on Dolan's shift when the passage was broken into. Dolan I have traced to Montana. The other 5 I have not been able to locate in any subsequent record connected to the Comstock or to Nevada. This is not surprising on its own. Shift labor on the Comstock turned over continuously. Men moved between the lode's various operations and then moved on to other fields, and tracking individual laborers through census and directory records across state lines is slow work with a high failure rate. What I can say is that of the 6 men who entered the southern lateral in November 1899, I have found evidence of only one. Dolan, and that one man left the state within 6 months and wrote a single letter about what he saw to the one person he trusted completely. And then, as far as the documentary record is concerned, never mentioned it again. The Comstock was not the only location in the American West where underground construction of clearly non-mining origin was encountered during the intensive hard rock mining period of the 1870s through 1900s. The silver and gold rushes that drove tunneling work across Nevada, California, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Idaho produced thousands of miles of underground survey and terrain that had never been systematically examined before. And the speed of that work, driven by the economics of ore extraction rather than by archaeological curiosity, meant that anomalies were encountered, briefly noted, and moved past on a schedule determined by the price of silver rather than by the nature of the find. The Huskies published a series of geological monographs on the Comstock and the surrounding Nevada mining districts between 1876 and 1904, several of which are available in full text through the Huskies Library in Reston, Virginia, and through the online digitization program that has made most pre-1920 federal geological publications accessible. I have read the relevant Comstock volumes. In the 1882 monograph covering the lower workings of the Ophir and Mexican mines, 2 of the Consolidated Virginia's neighbors on the lode, there is a footnote in the appendix on tunnel surveys that notes, without further elaboration, the encountering of finished wall surfaces inconsistent with current or historical mining practice in a deep section of the Ophir's 1,600-foot level. The footnote gives no dimensions, no description of what the surfaces enclosed, no indication of what, if anything, was found in the space they bounded. It says finished surfaces inconsistent with mining practice, and then it moves on to the next survey entry. I found one similar notation in an 1894 Colorado Geological Survey report covering a mine in Gilpin County, and one in an 1898 report from the Nevada State Mineralogist covering a property in Elko County. Each report identifies an anomaly briefly, notes that it was sealed as non-productive, and continues. These notations are not dramatic. They are the geological equivalent of a raised eyebrow, a professional observer recording what does not fit while staying in motion, because staying in motion is what the job requires. None of them, in any case I have found, generated a dedicated investigation. The passages were sealed and the notations were filed, and the main business of extracting ore continued, because ore is what paid for the survey work, and dressed stone walls are not ore. The geological surveys were not looking for underground architecture. What they found that was not ore, they recorded minimally and moved past. The Comstock case is the only case in this pattern where a War Department response is documented, which means it is the only case where whoever was notified had a prior framework for what the discovery represented and decided that military engineers, not mine engineers, were the appropriate next step. The pattern across these reports, when you assemble them from their separate collections and place them beside the Comstock superintendent's log, is consistent and illuminating in its consistency. Something is found underground. Someone notes it carefully and precisely enough that a record exists. The record goes into the archive of the institution that produced it. No follow-up is generated. The finding sits in the institutional record, accessible to anyone who is looking in the right collection for the right period, invisible to anyone who is not. The Comstock passage is the only case in this pattern where a War Department response is documented. That distinction matters. Every other case in the pattern produced a geological footnote and silence. The Comstock case produced a geological event and a military response and silence. The difference between those two outcomes is the difference between something that surprised the people who found it and something that the people who were notified already had a category for. If you know a researcher who works in the history of the American West's mining period, or in the archival records of the Army Corps of Engineers from the late 19th century, or in the Bancroft Library's Comstock collections, share this with them. The superintendent's log is at Berkeley. Dolan's letter is in Reno. The Lusk's reports with the marginal notations are in Reston. They have been accessible for decades. They have been assembled here for the first time, as far as I have been able to determine, because they sit in 3 different institutional collections on opposite sides of the country, connected by a thread that requires knowing all 3 exist in order to see what connects them. What was on those shelves is gone. If the partial War Department document is authentic, the materials were removed to a secure federal facility in November 1899, and I have not found any public record of where they went. If they were removed, they have been in federal custody for 125 years. If they were not removed, if the document is not authentic, and the Army's visit served some other purpose, then the southern lateral of the Consolidated Virginia Mine was sealed in November 1899 and has not been publicly entered since, and whatever Dolan saw on those shelves is still there, in a dry passage behind a sealed wall. In a mine whose workings extend below Virginia City in a network so extensive that the full inventory of its tunnels has never been completed. Patrick Dolan said the objects ran further than his lamp could show. He had been underground for 22 years. He knew what he was looking at. And then he went to Montana and wrote nothing more about it that has survived. We lost the knowledge of what was there the moment the Army arrived and restricted access. And the superintendent wrote 4 words in his log, and the next entry resumed normal operations elsewhere. What we have left is a shift foreman's letter to his wife, filed in a box of family correspondence, in a library in Reno, among papers that sat uncatalogued for 26 years before anyone could read them. The library is still there. The letter is still there. The mine's lower workings, sealed in sections, extend beneath Virginia City to this day. And somewhere in the southern lateral, behind whatever the Army engineers left when they finished their work in November 1899, the question of what a shift crew found on dressed stone shelves in an undocumented passage is still, formally, unanswered.